And then look what happens in verse 30. Then Elijah said to all the people, come near to me. So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. Make a note of that verse, because we're going to come back to that verse as well as how long will you falter between two opinions. But let's finish the story starting at verse 38. Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. Now, when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. And Elijah said to them, seize the prophet of Baal. Do not let one of them escape. So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon and executed them there. How many notice there's no participation trophies handed out at this one? I just wanted to throw that in there because it feels good. It might make sense to some. All right. In verse 21, Elijah, as the contest is about to erupt at the start, Elijah looks, you like that, Brian? That was for you. Elijah looks at the nation and says, how long will you falter between two opinions? How long will you be divided? How long will you be split? How long will you be torn between options? Now, it's a valuable question. It's actually a very profound question. And as we find out that a showdown is necessary, which we'll talk about in a little bit here. But I want to ask the question right now before we move on. You have to ask the question, how do you get to a point where you have multiple opinions? How do you actually get to the place in life where you are divided in your worship, in your attention, and who you're following? How do you actually get there? The answer is actually quite simple. It can be traced back to Solomon. And it's simply this. It's disobedience. How does Solomon disobey God? His main area of disobedience was God said, don't marry wives from pagan nations. But Solomon went ahead and did it anyways. And in that act, their form, their gods, lowercase g, that they worship became Solomon's worship, and it brought division. This is why you can't share land, if you will, with people that worship another god. You can't allow them to influence you, because if you do, their worship becomes yours. And that was, God said, this is an area that I'm not okay with you just kind of fitting in. And because of that, because of Solomon's disobedience, when you disobey God, you introduce yourself to what I would call a slippery slope of human reasoning. When you flat out disobey the Lord, when he says, don't do this, and you do it, you now open yourself up to whatever makes sense, whatever feels good. And human reasoning that is not submitted under the influence of God open up itself to what is called meology. Instead of it being theology, it actually becomes about you. And when it becomes about you, you have a different motivating system that motivates your beliefs. And largely, though, remember, if it's outside under the influence of the presence and the influence of God, you'll be driven by the lust of your flesh. You'll be driven by the desires of your mind. And you'll find anything that appeases you and makes you feel happy. And this is human reasoning at its worst. As you begin to justify your lifestyle, you begin to justify your decision, you begin to justify everything apart from the influence of God. That is how you get to a place in life where you have multiple opinions. It's literally from being disobedient to the Lord. This is what we introduce ourselves to. We introduce ourselves to human rationale. We introduce ourselves to logic and reason that's outside of faith. We begin to open up doors that were never designed to be opened. So here's Elijah. He's standing in front of the nation and says, how long are you going to falter between two opinions? They're so entrenched into their belief system. They're so locked in. They justified it. There's a culture and a society from the top down. It's immovable. This is why in some cases, you can't just debate out of something. Notice Elijah doesn't say, hey, Ahab, Jezebel, meet me in the courts and let's have a theological discussion about this. Sometimes that doesn't go anywhere. That actually entrenches it more. Because that's when scripture gets used to justify the other side. So sometimes you can't have a theological discussion. Now, in some contexts, absolutely. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but hear me out. There are instances where there has to literally be a showdown.